The wind howled across the Montana plains like a wild beast, carrying snow so thick that Jake Morrison could barely see his own hands gripping the steering wheel. His old pickup truck groaned against the blizzard as he drove the familiar route, back to his ranch. 20 years of working this land had taught him to respect winter storms, but this one was different. The Weather Service had called it a once-in-a-decade blizzard, and Jake was starting to believe them. His ranch sat on thousands of acres where his family had raised cattle for 3 generations. The land bordered the Blackfeet Reservation, and, over the years, Jake had developed a respectful relationship with his Native American neighbors. Unlike some ranchers in the area who viewed the reservation with suspicion, Jake understood that they were all just trying to make a living from the same harsh but beautiful land. As his truck crawled through the whiteout conditions, Jake's headlights caught something unusual on the side of the road. Through the swirling snow, he could make out what looked like a person hunched over near an old broken-down car. His heart sank. Nobody should be stuck out here in these conditions. The temperature was dropping fast, and exposure could kill someone within hours. Jake pulled over and grabbed his heavy coat and flashlight from behind the seat. The wind nearly knocked him over as he stepped out into the storm. Fighting his way through the snow, he approached the figure and found an elderly Native American man sitting in the driver's seat of a car that had clearly given up the fight against the cold. The engine was dead, and ice had formed on the inside of the windows. The old man looked up as Jake's flashlight illuminated his weathered face. His lips were blue, and his hands shook uncontrollably. Jake could see that hypothermia was already setting in. There was no time to waste asking questions or making introductions. This was a matter of life and death. "Sir, we need to get you out of here right now," Jake shouted over the wind. "My truck is warm and my ranch isn't far." The elderly man tried to speak, but his words came out as barely a whisper. Jake could see he was too weak to walk on his own. Without hesitation, Jake scooped the man up in his arms, surprised by how light he felt. Years of ranch work had made Jake strong, and he carried the man through the snow to his pickup truck like he was carrying a child. Once inside the warm cab, Jake cranked up the heat and grabbed a thermos of hot coffee from his dashboard. He helped the old man take small sips while rubbing his hands to get circulation going. Slowly, color began to return to the man's face, but Jake knew he needed proper medical attention and a warm place to recover. The drive to Jake's ranch house seemed to take forever in the storm, but finally the warm lights of home appeared through the snow. Jake's wife Sarah met them at the door. She took one look at the elderly man and immediately went into action, preparing hot soup and gathering warm blankets. Sarah had been a nurse before they got married, and her medical training kicked in as she assessed their unexpected guest. They helped the old man to the couch near the fireplace, where Sarah checked his vital signs and made sure he was warming up properly. As the hours passed and the storm continued to rage outside, their guest began to regain his strength. His name was Thomas Crow Feather, and he was a respected elder from the Blackfeet Reservation. Thomas explained that he had been driving back from a medical appointment in town when his old car broke down in the storm. He had been stranded for over an hour before Jake found him, and he knew that he probably wouldn't have survived much longer in those conditions. His eyes filled with tears as he thanked Jake and Sarah for saving his life. As the night wore on, Jake and Thomas talked by the fire. Thomas shared stories about his life on the reservation, his children and grandchildren, and the old ways of his people. Jake found himself fascinated by Thomas's wisdom and the deep connection he felt to the land they both called home. Despite their different backgrounds, they discovered they had much in common as men who had spent their lives working with their hands and respecting the power of nature. The storm continued for 3 days, making travel impossible. During that time, Thomas became like a member of Jake's family. He helped Sarah in the kitchen, shared meals with them, and told stories that captivated Jake's 2 teenage children. Thomas had a gift for storytelling, and his tales of the old days on the plains transported them to another time and place. When the storm finally cleared, Jake offered to drive Thomas back to the reservation. But before they left, Thomas asked to speak with Jake privately. They walked out to Jake's front porch where the morning sun was making the fresh snow sparkle like diamonds across the landscape. "You saved my life," Thomas said, his voice strong and clear in the crisp air. "In my culture, we don't forget such kindness. What you did means more than you know." Jake felt embarrassed by the praise. "Anyone would have done the same thing," he said. "You were in trouble and I was there to help. That's just what neighbors do." But Thomas shook his head. Not everyone would have stopped. Not everyone would have opened their home to a stranger. "You and your family showed me great honor, and my people will remember this." As they drove toward the reservation, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened during those 3 days. He had always tried to be a good neighbor, but Thomas's gratitude seemed to run deeper than simple thankfulness. There was something in the old man's eyes that suggested this moment would have consequences that reached far beyond a simple act of kindness during a storm. Thomas Crow Feather's homecoming to the Blackfeet Reservation was unlike any other. As Jake's pickup truck pulled into the small community where Thomas lived, people began emerging from their homes. Word had somehow spread that the respected elder had been missing during the storm, and his safe return brought visible relief to many faces. Jake watched as Thomas was embraced by family members who had feared the worst. Children ran up to hug their grandfather, and adults nodded respectfully as Thomas introduced Jake as the man who saved my life. The simple words carried weight in this close-knit community, where survival often depended on the kindness of others. An elderly woman who Jake later learned was Thomas's sister invited him inside for coffee. The small house was warm and filled with the aroma of traditional foods cooking on the stove. Family photos covered the walls, showing generations of Crow Feathers who had called this land home. Jake felt honored to be welcomed into such an intimate, family space. As they sat around the kitchen table, Thomas told his family the story of those 3 days. He spoke of how Jake had found him nearly frozen, how Sarah had nursed him back to health, and how the Morrison family had treated him not as a stranger but as one of their own. His words painted Jake as more than just a good Samaritan. He described him as a true friend who had risked his own safety to help someone in need. Thomas's nephew, a man named David who worked for the tribal council, listened intently to every detail. David had always been somewhat suspicious of the white ranchers who owned land adjacent to the reservation. Too many times in history, his people had been taken advantage of by outsiders who pretended friendship but had hidden motives. But as he watched his uncle's face while telling the story, David began to see that Jake Morrison was different. After Jake left to return to his ranch, Thomas spent the evening visiting with tribal elders and community leaders. In the traditional way, he shared his experience with those who held positions of respect within the tribe. Each telling of the story seemed to add layers of meaning, and by the next morning, everyone on the reservation had heard about the white rancher who had saved Thomas Crow Feather's life. But Thomas wasn't satisfied with simply sharing his story. In Blackfeet culture, acts of great kindness create obligations that must be honored. Thomas knew that Jake had not helped him expecting anything in return. That much was clear from the rancher's humble attitude. But that only made the debt of gratitude more significant. Thomas had been given the gift of life itself, and according to the ways of his ancestors, such a gift demanded a response. Thomas sought out the guidance of Margaret Standing Bear, the oldest woman on the reservation and a keeper of traditional knowledge. Margaret was 93 years old and had lived through times when interactions between Native Americans and white settlers were often hostile. She had witnessed broken treaties, forced relocations, and decades of mistrust. But she had also seen moments of genuine human connection that transcended racial boundaries. As Thomas sat with Margaret in her small cabin, he told her about Jake's selfless act and asked for her wisdom about how to properly honor such kindness. Margaret listened without interruption, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea as snow continued to fall outside her window. "This man," Margaret finally said, "he didn't save you because you were Indian or because you were white. He saved you because you were human and in need. That kind of heart is rare in any person regardless of their skin color." Margaret went on to explain that in the old days, when a warrior saved another's life, it created a bond that lasted forever. The saved person and their entire family became connected to their rescuer in a way that honored both parties. She suggested that Thomas should gather the warriors of the tribe, the men who still followed the traditional ways, and asked them to join him in showing proper respect to Jake Morrison. Thomas knew that Margaret's suggestion was both appropriate and significant. To have the warriors of the tribe formally acknowledge Jake's deed would be to elevate him to a position of honor rarely given to outsiders. It would signal to everyone in the community that Jake Morrison was to be treated as a friend and brother to the Blackfeet people. Over the next several days, Thomas visited the homes of warriors throughout the reservation. These weren't soldiers, in the modern sense, but men who had served their community with distinction, who lived according to traditional values, and who commanded respect among their people. Some were veterans who had served in Vietnam or other conflicts. Others were tribal leaders, teachers, or simply men known for their wisdom and integrity. Thomas's request was simple but profound. Would they join him in riding out to Jake Morrison's ranch to formally thank the man who had saved his life? The traditional way, they would come on horseback wearing their best clothes and carrying symbols of their heritage. It would be a gesture that honored both their ancient customs and Jake's modern act of kindness. One by one, the warriors agreed to participate. Joseph Running Wolf, a Vietnam veteran who still kept horses in the traditional way. Robert Fasthorse, a tribal council member who had devoted his life to preserving Blackfeet culture. Marcus Crow Dog, a teacher who instructed young people in the old ways. Each man understood the significance of what Thomas was proposing. Word of the planned honor ride spread throughout the reservation, and the excitement was palpable. Children asked their grandfathers to explain the meaning of such a ceremony. Elders nodded their approval, knowing that this would be a moment that bridged two worlds. Women began preparing special foods and gathering gifts that would be appropriate to present to Jake and his family. As the day of the honor ride approached, Thomas felt a deep satisfaction. He knew that Jake Morrison had no idea what was coming, but he also knew that the rancher would understand the sincerity behind the gesture. Some gifts could only be repaid with equal respect and honor, and Thomas was determined to give Jake the recognition he deserved. The morning of the ride dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow covering the landscape in pristine white. Thomas stood at his window watching as warriors began arriving at the designated gathering place. They came with their best horses, wearing traditional clothing mixed with modern ranch wear, carrying flags and symbols that represented their heritage and their individual families. As Thomas prepared his own horse and put on the clothes he had worn to important ceremonies throughout his life, he felt the presence of his ancestors guiding him. This was more than just a thank you visit. It was a bridge between cultures, a moment when the old ways would meet modern kindness and find common ground in shared humanity. The sound started as a distant rumble like approaching thunder on a clear day. Jake Morrison looked up from fixing a fence post, puzzled by the noise that seemed to roll across the snowy landscape toward his ranch. The morning sun was bright, and the sky was cloudless, so thunder made no sense. As he straightened up and shaded his eyes with his hand, Jake saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Coming across the open prairie toward his ranch was a line of horsemen stretching, as far as he could see. At first glance, Jake thought it might be some kind of movie production or historical reenactment, but as they drew closer, he realized this was something entirely different. These were real people on real horses, and they were heading directly toward his property. Jake dropped his tools and started walking toward his house, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The riders were still too far away to make out individual faces, but he could see colorful clothing, flowing hair, and what appeared to be flags or banners catching the wind. The rhythmic sound of 50 horses moving together across the frozen ground created a drumbeat that seemed to echo from the earth itself. Sarah heard the commotion and came out onto the front porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Jake, what in the world is that?" she called out, her voice filled with wonder and just a hint of concern. Their two children, Mike and Jenny, abandoned their Saturday morning cartoons and rushed outside to see what their parents were staring at. As the riders drew closer, Jake began to make out individual faces, and his breath caught in his throat. Leading the group was Thomas Crow Feather, sitting tall and proud on a beautiful paint horse. Thomas was wearing traditional clothing that Jake had never seen before. A decorated leather shirt, beaded accessories, and feathers in his long, gray, hair that flowed behind him as he rode. But Thomas wasn't alone. Behind him rode dozens of other men, all mounted on horses that looked like they had stepped out of history books. Some wore full traditional dress with elaborate headdresses and painted faces. Others combined modern Western wear with traditional accessories. All of them carried themselves with dignity and purpose that made it clear this was no casual visit. Jake's family stood transfixed as the procession approached their ranch. The sight was both beautiful and overwhelming, a living piece of history playing out in their front yard. The horse's breath created clouds in the cold air, and the jingle of bridles and traditional ornaments created a melody that seemed to come from another century. When the riders were about 100 yards from the house, Thomas raised his hand, and the entire group came to a halt with military precision. The sudden silence after the thunder of hooves was almost deafening. Thomas then rode forward alone, approaching Jake and his family with the bearing of a man on an important mission. "My friend Jake Morrison," Thomas called out in a voice that carried across the still air. "I have come with my brothers to honor you." Jake walked forward to meet Thomas, his heart pounding with emotion he couldn't quite name. Up close, he could see that Thomas had painted symbols on his face and was carrying a staff decorated with eagle feathers and beads. The old man's eyes sparkled with joy and solemnity as he continued speaking. "What you did for me during the storm was more than saving a life," Thomas said, his voice formal but filled with warmth. "You opened your home and your heart to a stranger. In the old ways of my people, such kindness creates bonds that must be honored." Thomas turned in his saddle and gestured toward the assembled warriors. "These are the warriors of the Blackfeet Nation. They have come to witness my gratitude and to welcome you as a brother to our people." At Thomas's signal, all 50 riders began moving forward slowly, forming a large semicircle around Jake's house and family. As they positioned themselves, Jake could see the incredible diversity of the group. There were old men who looked like they had lived through decades of hardship and change, middle-aged men who carried themselves with the confidence of leaders, and younger men whose eyes burned with pride in their heritage. Each warrior wore something that marked his individual identity within the group: different tribal regalia, family colors, or personal symbols that told stories Jake couldn't read but could feel the importance of. Some carried traditional weapons like spears and bows, while others held modern items like American flags or military insignia that spoke to their service in contemporary times. One by one, the warriors began calling out to Jake. Some spoke in English, others in their native language, but all were clearly offering words of respect and greeting. Joseph Running Wolf, a weathered veteran with silver braids, spoke for many when he called out, "We honor the man who saved our elder. We honor the family that opened their doors to one of ours." Robert Fasthorse, wearing a magnificent headdress that must have taken years to create, added his voice. "Jake Morrison, you showed us that good hearts exist in all people. We will remember your kindness for generations." The ceremony continued as various warriors shared brief speeches or called out traditional blessings. Some offered gifts, handmade items, blessed objects, or family treasures that represented their personal gratitude. Sarah accepted each gift with tears in her eyes, understanding that she was witnessing something extraordinary. Marcus Crow Dog, the teacher who worked to preserve traditional ways, dismounted and approached Jake directly. He carried a beautifully crafted ceremonial pipe, decorated with intricate beadwork and feathers. "This belongs to my grandfather's grandfather," he said quietly. "It has been in my family for over a century. I want you to have it as a symbol of the friendship between our families." Jake accepted the pipe with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the significance of the moment. He had no words adequate to express what he was feeling, but Thomas seemed to understand. "You don't need to speak," Thomas said gently. "Your actions already spoke for you. We came here not because we expect anything from you, but because our hearts demanded that we show proper respect." As the formal presentations concluded, something magical happened. The ceremony began to transform into a celebration. Some of the younger warriors started singing traditional songs, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to blend with the wind across the plains. Others began demonstrating riding skills, their horses dancing and spinning in displays of horsemanship that left Jake's children mesmerized. Sarah, ever the gracious hostess, invited everyone to stay for lunch, but Thomas politely declined. "We came to honor you," he said, "not to burden you with feeding 50 hungry warriors." But he did accept her invitation for him and a few elders to come inside for coffee and a chance to warm up before the long ride home. As the main group prepared to depart, each warrior made a point of personally acknowledging Jake and his family. Some shook hands, others offered traditional greetings, and a few simply nodded with the kind of respect usually reserved for fellow warriors. The message was clear. Jake Morrison had been formally accepted as a friend and brother to the Blackfeet people. The weeks following the honor ride brought changes to Jake Morrison's life that he never could have anticipated. Word of the ceremony spread far beyond the boundaries of his ranch and the reservation, creating ripples that reached into places Jake had never expected. Local newspapers picked up the story, and soon reporters from larger cities were calling to ask about the rancher who earned the respect of 50 Native American warriors. But the most meaningful changes were quieter and more personal. Thomas Crow Feather began visiting Jake's ranch regularly, not as a rescued man expressing gratitude, but as a genuine friend who enjoyed spending time with the Morrison family. These visits became a highlight of Jake's week, as Thomas shared knowledge about the land that went back generations before any European settlers had arrived. Thomas taught Jake to read the landscape in new ways, how to predict weather changes, by watching animal behavior, which plants could be used for medicine, and where to find the sweetest water even during drought years. In return, Jake shared his modern ranching techniques and equipment, showing Thomas innovations that could make life easier for families on the reservation. The friendship between the two men created a bridge between their communities that neither had existed before. Sarah found herself hosting wives and daughters from the reservation who came with Thomas on his visits. The women shared cooking techniques, child-rearing wisdom, and stories that helped both families understand each other's challenges and joys. Jake's children, Mike and Jenny, were perhaps the greatest beneficiaries of this new relationship. Thomas became like an additional grandfather to them, teaching them skills their own education had never covered. He showed Mike how to track animals through different seasons and how to understand the language of birds that could warn of approaching storms. Jenny learned to identify edible and medicinal plants, and Thomas taught her traditional songs that had been passed down through countless generations. The ceremonial pipe that Marcus Crow Dog had given to Jake became a symbol of the bond between the families. Jake kept it in a place of honor in his living room, and whenever Thomas visited, they would sometimes sit together in contemplative silence, sharing the kind of comfortable quiet that only exists between true friends. As winter turned to spring, the relationship between Jake's ranch and the reservation began to expand beyond personal friendship. David Crow Feather, Thomas's nephew who worked for the tribal council, approached Jake with a proposal that surprised everyone. The reservation was struggling with some of their cattle operations, and David wondered if Jake might be willing to share his expertise to help improve their herds. Jake not only agreed to help, but offered to do so without payment. He spent weekends on the reservation teaching younger tribal members about modern cattle management, veterinary care, and breeding techniques. In exchange, he learned traditional methods of animal husbandry that his own grandfather would have recognized, natural remedies, seasonal grazing patterns, and sustainable practices that had kept the plains healthy for thousands of years. The collaboration proved beneficial for both sides. The reservation's cattle operation improved significantly under Jake's guidance, while his own ranch benefited from the traditional ecological knowledge that Thomas and others shared with him. Jake began implementing rotational grazing patterns based on ancient wisdom, and his land became healthier and more productive than it had ever been. But perhaps the most significant change was in how other ranchers and townspeople began to view the relationship between white settlers and Native Americans in their area. Jake's friendship with Thomas and his acceptance by the Blackfeet warriors challenged long-held prejudices and assumptions on both sides of the cultural divide. Some of Jake's neighboring ranchers were initially suspicious of his growing involvement with the reservation. A few older ranchers, set in their ways and nursing generational prejudices, questioned whether Jake was being taken advantage of or manipulated. But as they saw the practical benefits of his collaboration with tribal members, and as they witnessed the genuine affection between the two families, attitudes began to shift. Similarly, some members of the reservation community had initially wondered whether Jake's kindness was genuine or if he had hidden motives. But Thomas's unwavering endorsement of his friend, combined with Jake's consistent actions over months of friendship, gradually won over even the most skeptical tribal members. The transformation was perhaps most visible during a community crisis that spring. A late-season blizzard threatened both reservation and ranch livestock, and instead of each community struggling alone, they coordinated their response. Jake organized his fellow ranchers to share equipment and resources with tribal ranchers, while reservation members contributed traditional knowledge about protecting animals during severe weather. The joint effort saved hundreds of cattle and horses that might otherwise have been lost. But more importantly, it demonstrated that cooperation between the communities was not only possible, but beneficial for everyone involved. What had started as one man's simple act of kindness during a storm had grown into a model for how different cultures could work together for mutual benefit. Local churches began inviting speakers from the reservation to share their history and perspectives. The high school started offering courses in Native American studies, with tribal elders serving as guest teachers alongside Jake's children's regular instructors. The annual county fair began including traditional Native American arts, crafts, and foods alongside the usual agricultural displays. These changes didn't happen overnight, and they weren't always smooth. There were misunderstandings, cultural missteps, and moments when old prejudices resurfaced on both sides. But Thomas and Jake served as living examples of how friendship could transcend racial and cultural differences, and their example inspired others to make similar efforts. Jake often reflected on how much his life had changed since that snowy night when he found Thomas stranded by the roadside. What had seemed like a simple decision to help someone in need had opened doors to experiences and relationships he never could have imagined. His family had been enriched by traditions and knowledge that went back centuries, while his ranch had become more productive and sustainable through the application of ancient wisdom. But perhaps the most profound change was in Jake's understanding of his place in the larger community. He had always thought of himself as just a rancher trying to make a living from the land. Now he realized that he was part of a much larger story, one that included the Native Americans who had lived on this land for thousands of years before. His family arrived, and the future generations who would inherit the results of how well different communities learned to work together. As spring progressed and the anniversary of his meeting with Thomas approached, Jake found himself planning something special. He wanted to commemorate not just the night he had found Thomas in the storm, but the year of friendship and growth that had followed. He began discussing with Sarah and the children the possibility of hosting a celebration that would bring together both communities for a shared feast and ceremony. The idea for a commemoration feast grew from a simple conversation between Jake and Thomas into something much larger and more meaningful than either man had originally envisioned. As word spread through both communities about the planned celebration, the response was overwhelming. What had started as a small gathering to mark the anniversary of their meeting transformed into a historic event that would bring together hundreds of people from both sides of the cultural divide. Sarah Morrison threw herself into the planning with characteristic enthusiasm, but she quickly realized that organizing an event of this magnitude required help from both communities. She reached out to Margaret Standing Bear, the elderly keeper of traditional knowledge who had first advised Thomas about how to properly honor Jake's kindness. Together, the two women began coordinating what would become the largest cross-cultural celebration the area had ever seen. The planning process itself became an exercise in bridge building. Sarah learned about traditional Blackfeet feast protocols, while Margaret and other tribal women taught her the significance of different foods, seating arrangements, and ceremonial elements. In return, Sarah shared her experience with large-scale event planning and introduced tribal organizers to local businesses and suppliers who could help with logistics. Jake found himself in the unusual position of being the guest of honor at an event he was helping to organize. Thomas insisted that the celebration should recognize not just Jake's original act of kindness, but the year of friendship and cooperation that had followed. The event would serve multiple purposes: honoring Jake and his family, celebrating the growing partnership between the communities, and creating a template for future cooperation. As the date approached, both communities contributed to the preparations in ways that reflected their unique strengths and traditions. Tribal members provided traditional foods, ceremonial items, and cultural performances, while ranchers and townspeople contributed barbecue equipment, tables, chairs, and logistical support. The collaboration required constant communication and compromise, but it also created new friendships and understanding between people who had never interacted before. The location for the celebration was carefully chosen. Rather than holding it at Jake's ranch or on the reservation, the organizers selected a meadow that sat exactly on the border between the two communities. This neutral ground had historical significance as a place where tribal members and early settlers had sometimes met for trading and negotiations. Using this location sent a message that the celebration belonged to both communities equally. 3 days before the event, Jake received a surprise that moved him to tears. A delegation of tribal elders, led by Thomas, arrived at his ranch with a gift that represented months of secret preparation. They had commissioned a traditional Blackfeet star quilt, hand-stitched by the reservation's most skilled quilters, with patterns that told the story of Jake's rescue of Thomas and the friendship that had grown from it. The quilt was a masterpiece of craftsmanship and storytelling. The central star pattern was surrounded by symbols representing the storm, the rescue, Jake's family, and the honor ride of the 50 warriors. Each element had been carefully chosen to reflect specific aspects of their shared story, and the colors, deep blues for the storm, warm yellows for the hospitality of Jake's home, and rich reds for the bonds of friendship, created a visual narrative that would preserve the story for future generations. As Jake ran his hands over the intricate stitching, Thomas explained that in Blackfeet tradition, star quilts were among the most precious gifts a family could give. They were typically reserved for life's most important moments: births, marriages, deaths, and occasions when someone had earned the deepest respect of the community. The fact that the entire reservation had contributed to creating this quilt, for Jake, represented an honor rarely given to anyone outside the tribe. The morning of the celebration dawned perfect, with clear skies and mild temperatures that seemed to bless the gathering. People began arriving at the meadow before sunrise, and by mid-morning, the scene looked like something from a historical pageant. Traditional teepees had been erected alongside modern pavilions. Smoke rose from both traditional fire pits and contemporary barbecue grills. Children from both communities ran together between the preparations, their laughter creating a soundtrack of joy that set the tone for the entire day. Jake's extended family had traveled from across the state to attend the celebration, many meeting Thomas and other tribal members for the first time. Similarly, tribal members from other reservations had come to witness this unprecedented gathering. The crowd included ranchers, farmers, tribal leaders, veterans, teachers, students, and families, representing the full diversity of rural Montana life. The formal ceremony began at noon, with both traditional Blackfeet protocols and contemporary elements that made everyone feel included. Thomas served as the primary host, welcoming everyone to the celebration and explaining its significance. He told the complete story of that winter night, the honor ride, and the year of friendship that had followed, emphasizing how one act of kindness had grown into something that benefited entire communities. Jake was asked to speak, and he struggled to find words adequate to express his feelings. He talked about how helping Thomas had seemed like the most natural thing in the world, but how the friendship that followed had taught him more than he had ever imagined possible. He thanked the tribal community for welcoming his family and sharing their knowledge, and he challenged everyone present to look for opportunities to bridge differences and build understanding in their own lives. The formal presentations included the gifting of the star quilt to Jake's family, along with other items that would forever link the Morrisons to the Blackfeet Nation. Jake and Sarah reciprocated by presenting gifts to Thomas and other tribal leaders, items that represented their own family's history and their commitment to continued friendship. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus Crow Dog, the teacher, who had given Jake the ceremonial pipe, announced that the tribal council had voted to grant Jake and his family honorary membership in the Blackfeet Nation. This was an almost unprecedented honor for a non-native family, and it carried with it both privileges and responsibilities that would last for generations. As the formal ceremony concluded, the celebration transformed into a festival that showcased the best of both cultures. Traditional drummers and dancers performed alongside country musicians and square dancers. Children learned games from both traditions. Adults shared stories, compared experiences, and discovered commonalities they had never recognized before. The feast itself was a fusion of flavors and traditions that reflected the collaborative spirit of the entire event. Traditional fry bread was served alongside barbecued beef. Wild rice dishes sat next to potato salad. Tribal members shared traditional medicines and teas with ranchers who offered their own home remedies and folk wisdom. As the sun began to set, painting the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jake found himself standing with Thomas at the edge of the meadow, watching the celebration continue around them. The two men stood in comfortable silence, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Did you ever imagine that helping one old man in a storm would lead to all this?" Thomas asked quietly. Jake shook his head, smiling, at the scene before them. "I never imagined any of it, but I'm grateful for every moment." Thomas nodded, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "This is just the beginning, my friend. What we've built here will outlast both of us. Our children and grandchildren will carry these friendships forward, and the story of this day will be told for generations." As if to prove his point, they watched Jake's daughter Jenny teaching traditional beating techniques to a group of young ranchers' daughters, while his son Mike joined tribal boys his age in a friendly competition of traditional games. The future of cross-cultural cooperation was literally playing out in front of them, carried forward by young people who would grow up seeing such friendships as natural and normal, rather than extraordinary. 5 years have passed since that snowy night when Jake Morrison found Thomas Crowfeather stranded on a lonely Montana road, and the ripples from that single act of compassion continue to spread in ways that surprise everyone involved. What began as one man helping another during a winter storm has transformed into a model of cross-cultural cooperation that extends far beyond the boundaries of their small Montana communities. The annual commemoration feast has become a tradition that draws visitors from across the region. Each year, the gathering grows larger as word spreads about this unique celebration of friendship and cooperation. University researchers have studied the event as an example of successful community building, while government officials point to it as a model for improving relationships between Native American communities and their neighbors. Jake's Ranch has become an unofficial training center for sustainable agriculture that combines modern techniques with traditional ecological wisdom. Young ranchers from across the state come to learn the integrated approach that Jake developed, with guidance from Thomas and other tribal elders. The success of his operation, which consistently outproduces neighboring ranches while using fewer resources, has attracted attention from agricultural colleges and environmental organizations. The Morrison children, now young adults, carry the lessons of their unique childhood into their professional lives. Jenny graduated from college with degrees in both education and Native American studies, and she has returned to teach at the local high school, where she incorporates tribal history and culture into her curriculum. Her classroom regularly hosts tribal elders as guest speakers, continuing the bridge-building work that started in her family's living room. Mike chose a different path, but one equally influenced by his friendship with Thomas and the tribal community. He studied veterinary medicine with a focus on large animal care, and his practice serves both ranch and reservation communities. His office walls display both his veterinary credentials and traditional Native American art, reflecting the dual heritage of knowledge that shapes his approach to animal care. Thomas, now in his 80s, remains active despite his advancing age. He has become something of a celebrity in Native American circles, traveling to other reservations to share the story of how one act of kindness created lasting change between communities. His talks emphasize that building bridges between cultures requires patience, respect, and willingness to see past surface differences to the common humanity beneath. The ceremonial pipe that Marcus Crow Dog gave to Jake has become a symbol of the enduring friendship between the families. Jake has learned the proper protocols for its care and use, and it now sits in a special display case alongside the star quilt and other gifts that represent his honorary membership in the Blackfeet Nation. Visitors to the ranch often ask about these items, giving Jake opportunities to share the story and its lessons with new audiences. Sarah has channeled her experience organizing the first commemoration feast into a broader mission of community service. She now coordinates cultural exchange programs between schools, helps organize powwows that welcome participants from all backgrounds, and serves on the board of several organizations working to preserve both Native American traditions and pioneer history. Her kitchen table has become a meeting place where tribal leaders and local ranchers gather to discuss everything from water rights to educational policy. The success of the cooperation between Jake's ranch and the reservation has inspired similar partnerships throughout the region. Other ranchers have begun reaching out to tribal communities, offering to share knowledge and resources in mutually beneficial arrangements. The model of combining traditional ecological knowledge with modern technology has proven so successful that it's being replicated in other states where Native American communities and agricultural operations coexist. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy is visible in the everyday interactions between community members who once viewed each other with suspicion or indifference. Children who grew up attending the annual feasts think nothing of having friends from different cultural backgrounds. High school students regularly participate in cultural exchange programs. Adults collaborate on projects ranging from historical preservation to economic development initiatives. The local rodeo now includes traditional Native American horse competitions alongside conventional events. The county fair features both pioneer, heritage exhibits and displays of traditional tribal arts and crafts. Churches host interfaith services that incorporate elements from both Christian and traditional Native American spiritual practices. These changes reflect a community that has learned to celebrate its diversity rather than be divided by it. The relationship between Jake and Thomas remains at the heart of all these developments, but it has evolved from gratitude-based friendship into something deeper and more complex. The two men have become genuine confidants, sharing their hopes for their grandchildren, their concerns about environmental changes affecting the land they both love, and their dreams for continued cooperation between their communities. Thomas often jokes that Jake saved his life twice, once from the storm and again by giving him a purpose in his elder years. His role as a bridge builder between communities has brought meaning and energy to his final decades, while Jake's friendship has enriched his understanding of his own heritage and traditions. Jake, in turn, credits Thomas with teaching him that being a good neighbor means more than just helping during emergencies. It means taking time to understand different perspectives, being willing to learn from people whose experiences are different from your own, and recognizing that cultural differences can be sources of strength rather than division. The story of Jake Morrison and Thomas Crowfeather has been featured in magazines, documentaries, and books about successful cross-cultural cooperation. Academic researchers study their community as an example of how historical tensions can be overcome through personal relationships and mutual respect. Government officials visit to learn about practical approaches to improving relations between Native American communities and their neighbors. But for all the attention and recognition, Jake and Thomas remain focused on the simple principles that started their friendship: treating every person with dignity, helping others when they're in need, and recognizing that kindness creates connections that can last for generations. They continue to meet regularly, sometimes at Jake's ranch, sometimes at Thomas's home on the reservation, sharing coffee and conversation that ranges from local gossip to profound reflections on life and meaning. As Thomas approaches his 90th birthday, he often reflects on the unexpected trajectory his life took after that winter storm. He had expected to spend his final years quietly, passing on traditional knowledge to his grandchildren and watching the world change around him. Instead, he found himself at the center of a movement that demonstrates how individual acts of kindness can create lasting social change. The star quilt that the reservation created for Jake has inspired similar projects in other communities. The tradition of honor rides has been revived for other occasions when tribal members want to recognize exceptional kindness from outsiders. The annual feast has become a template that other communities have adapted for their own cross-cultural celebrations. Most importantly, the friendship between Jake Morrison and Thomas Crow Feather has shown that the historical divides between Native American communities and their neighbors are not insurmountable. Their story proves that with genuine respect, patient effort, and willingness to see past surface differences, people from very different backgrounds can build relationships that benefit everyone involved. The legacy of that snowy night continues to grow, touching lives in ways that Jake never could have imagined when he stopped to help a stranded stranger. In a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, their story stands as proof that simple human kindness remains one of the most powerful forces for positive change. It demonstrates that every person has the potential to be a bridge builder, and that the most ordinary acts of compassion can create extraordinary results when they come from a genuine heart. Today, when visitors ask Jake about the secret to building successful relationships across cultural divides, his answer remains beautifully simple. Just treat people like human beings. Help when you can, listen more than you talk, and remember that we're all trying to make the best lives we can for our families. Everything else builds from there. The story that began with 50 warriors riding out to honor a rancher has become something much larger, a testament to the power of human connection. To overcome any barrier that history, culture, or circumstance might place between people of goodwill,